Thanks so much for coming today. My name is Margaret Bridges, and I want to welcome you to the Early Development and Learning Seminar, sponsored by the Center for Child and Youth Policy in the School of Social Welfare at UC Berkeley. We are grateful to have the opportunity through CCYP to bring people together on a variety of topics to engage with experts on pressing issues related to children aged 0 to 8. As you may have heard, we at Berkeley are launching a program in early development and learning. It's a new interdisciplinary program, officially launching in the fall 2016 with an undergraduate major focused on the innovative, research-based knowledge and practice needed to understand and support young children and their families. We are really excited about it. We hope you are too, and hope that you can sign in and provide us feedback moving forward about things you'd like to hear about. This type of community event will be part of the new program. So, welcome to our seminar, the 30 million word gap, providing language-rich environments for dual language preschoolers. We are thrilled to be hearing from experts, Catherine Snow, Jeannette Mancilla-Martinez, and Robin Pence today. First, we'll be hearing from Dr. Catherine Snow, the Patricia Alberg Graham Professor of Education at the School of Education at Harvard. Dr. Snow is an expert on language and literacy, development in young children, focusing on how oral language skills are acquired and how they relate to literacy outcomes. She has chaired the National Academy of Sciences committee that prepared the report Preventing Reading Difficulties in Young Children, as well as chaired the RAND Reading Study Group that prepared the report Reading for Understanding toward an R&D program in reading comprehension. Her list of achievements is very long and includes having conducted a longitudinal study on language and literacy skills among low-income children that started when the children were 3 and has continued 15 years hence. She has followed the language development of young children participating in the Early Head Start intervention. She's studied the vocabulary development of first and second language learners, and considered aspects of transfer from the first language to the second language in the domains of language and literacy. Her book, Preparing Our Teachers, Opportunities for Better Reading Instruction, is part of an effort to develop consensus among teacher educators about what pre- and in-service elementary teachers need to know about language and literacy. She's also written extensively about bilingualism and its relation to language policy issues in the United States and in developing nations, as well as about testing policy. Finally, she's currently involved in efforts to improve middle school literacy in the Boston Public Schools. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Catherine Snow.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you all for coming. It's remarkably reassuring to see that so many people are interested in this really important issue of early childhood programs for dual language learners. I understood that my task in about 15 minutes, was to give a kind of a general, just some general big picture ideas about early childhood education. My ideas in this regard are not explicitly focused on English language learners. There were dual language learners. They're focused on kids learning language, which includes everybody, but some need more attention than others, let's put it that way. And those are the ones I'm particularly focused on. This term, the 30 million word gap, I suppose everybody probably knows where that comes from, but just in case you don't, this is the origin of the 30 million word gap. This is not actually a portrayal of the 30 million word gap. This is a portrayal of gaps across groups of children in how quickly they acquire vocabulary. Each of those curves represents a cumulative vocabulary knowledge curve for one group of children or another. The top line, the dotted line, is for children of highly educated professional parents, and the bottom line is for children of isolated welfare parents. And the work was done by going to visit the families on a regular basis, and at every recording, the researchers would write down how many new words they heard the children produce, right? How many more words this week than last week, and then averaged over the children in the different groups. You get these rather strikingly different cumulative vocabulary curves, where, interestingly, I think, it starts, for those of you in the back, it starts at 10 months. There are no social class differences in vocabulary development at 10 months, but they emerge very early. By 14 months, the children of very professional, highly educated parents are starting to acquire vocabulary more quickly. And then by about 22, 24 months, the welfare families and the more working class but not socially isolated families start to generate differences in the paths that their children are taking toward vocabulary knowledge. Now, sort of these three curves, this is work by Hart and Risley, work that was done in the 80s and reported in a book that came out in 1995. It took a little while to gather the appropriate attention from policymakers and educators. But those curves end at 36 months. But all the evidence from work that I've done with David Dickinson on low-income families and that other people have done would suggest that you could just draw those curves straight out, just extend those lines to age 4 or age 5. And what you get at age 4 or age 5 is that the lowest group of children, as they enter kindergarten, know perhaps only about half as many words as the kids in the top group. That, however, is still not the 30 million word gap, because obviously no kid knows 30 million words more than any other kid. There aren't 30 million words in the language, actually. This is the 30 million word gap. This is an estimate of how much parents in those three groups are talking to their children. What percentage of the time that they're together in the room that the parents are actually addressing the children. And there are many other such analyses in the Hart and Risley book, Meaningful Differences in the Everyday Experiences of Young American Children. But what is striking is that in every case, if you spend an hour, if you do an hour's observation, the lowest group, in the low education group, the parents spend much less time interacting with the children. If they are interacting with the children, they talk less. When they talk, they use fewer different words. So that on every single measure, the lowest SES group, and then the middle SES, the somewhat higher, and then the very high SES group, look different in the intensity of the interaction and the number of words produced. And that is what is called the 30 million word gap, the accumulated difference in how many words kids have heard by the time they enter school. And it's quite striking here if you look at the empty circles at the bottom, that the 6 welfare parents on average produced fewer words, less talk with their children when they were 14 months old. But then at 22 months, they kind of moved up, right, as the kids are starting to produce words themselves. But then the professional parents continue to produce more and more, have more and more interaction time with their children, whereas the lower educated families went back down again. And the evidence is quite strong that The differences that you see in children's vocabulary are present by the age of 2, as you saw in those curves, get bigger until children are about age 5, and then level off and remain exactly the same, but they are already enormous. Right? So there is no shrinking of those social class differences in vocabulary, and that you might think that's what schools would be good for, but it does seem that it's really hard for schools to shrink those differences at that point. So these were all English-speaking kids. What about dual language learners? Well, let me present some data from collected by my former colleagues, Mancilla-Martinez, who's currently at Boston College, and Patton Tabers, in assessing language skills among children from Latino families attending Head Start. These are children who are 4, and they were tested on two equivalent vocabulary measures. An English measure, that's on the vertical axis, and a Spanish measure, that's on the horizontal axis. So every one of these dots represents a child, and where the child scored on English versus Spanish, and standardized vocabulary assessments. And these are standardized vocabulary assessments that use scores the way IQ tests use scores. 100 is the population norm, and 15 points is standard deviation. So what you notice is that the vast majority of these kids were scoring at about 70 in both Spanish and English, more than a standard deviation below the population norm. Now, you might say it's not surprising they're scoring low in English. They're from Spanish-speaking homes, and they're just learning English. But if that's the case, then it's somewhat alarming that they're scoring below the norm on that far below the norm on Spanish as well. There's a lot of talk in the literature about the advantages of being bilingual, and obviously there are huge advantages to being bilingual, but it seems as if the cognitive and executive function advantages of being bilingual arise particularly for children who are at least at normative levels in both their languages. So you can see that there's one child in this rather large group who benefits from being bilingual, that one up there in the top right corner. And there are a bunch of kids who score above 100 in English. These are kids perhaps whose families are largely English speaking, have already shifted to English, and it's not too surprising that they don't have large vocabularies in Spanish. And there's this scattering over here who score above the mean in Spanish. These are kids who are just starting to learn English in their Head Start classrooms. But the bulk of these kids are clearly limited in vocabulary in both languages. And that is really a very worrying fact, because vocabulary is the best single predictor of long-term academic outcomes. Vocabulary at age 5 pretty much predicts reading comprehension at age 10. And it's very hard to shift it after age 5. So this is the standard talk right now. All right, I've just given you the standard talk. And now I'm going to say it's really the wrong talk. Because I have, I think, really been talking too much about vocabulary, as if vocabulary is the key item here. There are, of course, big social class differences in word scores, and there are differences between monolingual and dual language learners in word scores, and they start early and they persist across time. There is this 30 million word gap in how much they've heard, perhaps. And thus there are increasing pressures on early childhood settings to compensate, right? And you see that in the professional development and in the practices that are going on in early childhood settings. But I would like to argue that vocabulary here is not the illness, it is the thermometer. It is merely the way we measure what the real differences are among the kids. The real gap is not a word gap, it's an Encyclopedia Britannica's worth of knowledge gap. It's because every one of those words that one child knows and another child doesn't know, links to a whole conceptual network of ideas and knowledge, right? So it's not a question of learning more words. That's not what we need to worry about. We need to think about, what do kids need to know? And if we focus on what they need to know, they will learn the words that go with those domains of knowledge. And I think we've sort of misled early childhood educators and policymakers to some extent by focusing so much on the vocabulary gap idea and not enough on the knowledge gap idea. So I'm arguing then that the gap is really about content. The social class differences in domains of knowledge are indexed by vocabulary, and they arise, just as the vocabulary gap arises, from big differences across families in how much they talk to kids about things that matter. Talking in ways that build knowledge stores. Quality language input means more than lots of words. It also means, at a bare minimum, lots of different words, not just more of the same words, but more different words. And it means words embedded in conceptual structures. It means words that are heard and produced and used in the context of talking about interesting topics. So the current response, unfortunately, the very large policy response in the world right now to the 30 million word gap is to tell parents and early childhood educators to talk more. In Providence, Mayor Bloomberg of New York City gave Providence $1 million to do something called Providence Talks, where the model is you give an automatic voice counter and recorder to families, and they get feedback about how much they've talked. Not what they've talked about, not whether it's responsive talk, but just whether you're talking to kids. Right? Denver Talks Back, the same program. It's going on, lots of different versions of this sort of social messaging as well as intervention is all about talk more, and it needs to be about talk better. Maybe you can't see that so well, but in the middle there's one response to this in a Chilean early childhood classroom. It's a word wall. Well, these are 4-year-olds. I'm not sure a word wall is quite the right thing to do for 4-year-olds. Right? And quite frankly, it isn't working very well. You've got classrooms like this one here, which is in Santiago, with lots of kids. They're all bundled up because there's no heating in the schooling in Santiago, so the kids go to school in winter and never take their coats off. And what there is a lot of teachers under the influence of these new policies talking more to kids, but not talking more with kids, not giving kids more chance to talk to them. The classroom over on your left is in Xinjiang in China, and once again it's an effort to provide better early childhood education for Uyghur children, minority language children in the part of China they refer to as East Turkestan. And once again, it's a teacher standing up in the front of the room talking a lot. This is more language, but it's not necessarily better language. So I'm going to propose two kind of mergeable alternatives, two approaches to this issue that would be better, and that would be even better if we put them together. Knowledge-infused curricula in early childhood classrooms that would support talk about more interesting topics, and building second language skills for kids we're worried about in California, English language skills on first language knowledge. There's just lots of evidence that support from first language improves second language skills, and that knowing something in L1 makes it easier to acquire the language for talking about that thing in L2. I'm going to give you just a little bit of hard data here from an experimental study. It was done in Head Start classrooms in Arizona by a former student of mine, Carl Hermans. I talk about this whenever I can because I keep trying to get Carl to publish these data. What he did was he taught the teachers in these Head Start programs, Arizona, an English-only state, but Head Start is not an English-only program, He taught the teachers to do dialogic reading, to read books with the kids. He picked a bunch of targeted vocabulary items and put them and identified books, 2 books in which those words appeared. And so in some classrooms, the teachers read both of those books in English. In other classrooms, the teachers read only one of those books, first in Spanish and then in English. So half the kids got half as much English because half the time was devoted to Spanish. And the question is then, which group learned the English vocabulary better? Well, the top line there are the kids who had Spanish first and then English. And the next line, the red line, is kids who had twice as much English, but learned less English as a result. Because of the dialogic reading, they still learned a little more than the control kids, but not nearly as much as the children who'd had the chance to acquire the knowledge in Spanish. The same pattern emerged, not quite as strongly, for general vocabulary, not even the vocabulary explicitly being taught, but on a general vocabulary assessment. The other really interesting and somewhat saddening finding from this study was that the children who had Spanish first also learned more Spanish, had a better performance on Spanish vocabulary at the end, but the children who had English and then English had a depressed performance in Spanish as compared to control kids. So not only did they not benefit in English, but they lost access to Spanish, both targeted and general vocabulary. So and this is just a few of a lot of cases that I could cite where first language support, teaching kids what looks like spending time on L1 turns out to benefit outcomes in L2. I'm working with Vibeke Grover, a Norwegian researcher, who is giving immigrant children in Oslo books to take home in their native language so that they get to read the books in the native language before the teacher in the Barnehage reads them in Norwegian. Those are bilingual books over there from the project in Xinjiang, which has greatly improved outcomes in Chinese for children from getting books that are bilingual, both in Uyghur and Chinese. In a program in South Africa, both Sotho and Zulu bilingual classrooms turn out to produce better English outcomes than English-only classrooms. But the question then is, so what goes on in these classrooms? What should the content be? And one of the things that drives me crazy, quite frankly, in early childhood classrooms is that people don't think very seriously about what the content should be. They think, oh, well, they're kids. Let's do fun stuff with them, right? So the default curriculum is, well, we have to start with the home because everybody has a home. If you think about it, that's what the kids know how to talk about. That's where they come from. And then we talk about the classroom because they all have a classroom. And then if it's October, we talk about pumpkins. At least in New England we do. And then in November we talk about turkeys, and then in December in New England we talk about snowflakes. Actually, this year in New England we talked about snowflakes all the way through April. But these are not worthless topics, but they're banal topics. They are not topics that generate rich and elaborated knowledge structures. And I would like to challenge us as a community worried about early childhood to really raise the bar here on the kind of information that young children are exposed to. And to kind of think about the fact that kids fail at 4th grade reading, not because they can't read the words, because they don't have the background knowledge presupposed in the texts. So let's think about what they're going to need to know in 4th grade to read those texts, the history texts, the science texts, and think about starting to build that knowledge base with 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, right? The best predictor of school success is world knowledge. We measure it with vocabulary, but it isn't the vocabulary that does the work. It's the world knowledge behind the vocabulary. So I'm proposing here focusing on content and letting the words take care of themselves. And then still we have this problem of what content? Well, as I suggest, one possibility is start with 4th grade. What do kids read about in 4th grade books? This is a somewhat randomly generated list. from vague memories of what my son read in 4th grade, but you know, they read about nutrition, you read about community, you do a little geography, you do maybe some literature, certainly, some history, some art, some music, some sports. I mean, you read about cities and nations and solar systems and agriculture and products from different countries, and this is stuff that some 4th graders know a lot about before they start to read, and other 4th graders know very little about before they start to read. So one approach to thinking about preschool curriculum, this might sound really ridiculous to you, but I think it would be worth trying, is to start here and devise ways to build this knowledge into the preschool curriculum. But there's another very different approach, which would be to think, well, you know, they're very little children and you can't teach them a lot of stuff if they're not interested. So let's figure out what they're interested in. What are 3-year-olds interested in? Animals, bugs, dinosaurs, princesses, water and sand, Play-Doh, dancing, what people believe, who's my friend and who's not my friend, how do I solve problems, how do I solve conflicts. There's lots and lots of things that kids are interested in that could become sources of topics, of rich content-infused topics in early childhood programs. And if you look at this list, any one of these topics could be what gets talked about in a dinner table conversation with well-educated parents who pay attention to their kids' questions, who answer their kids' questions. Kids ask incredible numbers of questions. Kids ask 100 questions an hour, a lot of which, unfortunately, in many households don't get answered. But they're questions about things just like this. So here's my little thought experiment. You take that list of kid interests. Not every kid has all of them, but every kid has a few of them, and you map those directly onto adult disciplines. You treat them as disciplinary knowledge. Right? The kid calls it dinosaurs. We call it paleontology. The kid calls it bugs. We call it biology. The kid calls it jungles. We call it geography or ecology. And that taking a more sort of disciplinary organizational strategy to thinking about doing things that are absolutely not, never uninteresting to children, that have to start with what children are interested in, would, I argue, be a way of preparing children much better and really shrinking the Encyclopedia Britannica worth of knowledge gap that plagues American educational system. So where do kids get this relevant knowledge? Obviously from being read to, being talked to, from early childhood classroom activities with curricular content, from dinner table conversations if they're substantive, from having their questions answered. And so here's this very, very simple model. A domain of knowledge leads to exposure to the words associated with that domain of knowledge, which leads to opportunities to deepen and broaden the knowledge domain because the kids learn the words and then they ask more and more questions. So this is like the world's simplest model for how to change early childhood education. And here's a very specific example of it. Let's say the knowledge domain is metamorphosis. Now think about all those wonderful books out there about the knowledge domain of metamorphosis, starting with A Very Hungry Caterpillar. The topic of metamorphosis leads kids to exposure to all of the words associated with metamorphosis, ideally in the language the child speaks best, the language the child can talk to his parents in. And learning those words in the home language then leads almost automatically to ease of acquisition of those words in the school language. That is what I would argue would be the appropriate approach to thinking about early childhood education for dual language learners. Thank you.
Currently, she is an assistant professor of language literacy and technology in the School of Education at University of California, Irvine. And congratulations to Jeannette. She's recently accepted a position at Vanderbilt University at Peabody College, effective July of this year. Her work focused on the language and literacy development of students whose ages span toddlerhood through adolescence and who are from linguistically diverse homes. Dr. Mancilla-Martinez conducts research that informs classroom instruction and shapes policy to close the reading achievement gap. Her longitudinal work to date underscores the need to focus on promoting linguistically diverse students' language development before and during formal schooling. She is a 2013 National Academy of Education Spencer Postdoctoral Fellow, as well as a 2013 Hellman Fellow. Dr. Mancilla-Martinez has presented her work widely at professional conferences, domestically and internationally, including at the American Educational Research Association, the Scientific Study of Reading, and the Society for Research in Child Development, as well as the National Dual Language Institute. Her work is also featured in several peer-reviewed journals, including the Journal of Educational Psychology, Child Development, Reading and Writing, and the TESOL Quarterly, and she is co-author of Teaching Vocabulary to English Language Learners. We will be hearing her presentation next on Spanish-speaking dual language learners' vocabulary knowledge. Dr. Mancilla-Martinez.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And maybe not, it won't be so hard to believe that my talk, I think, meshes really nicely with Catherine's. After all, she was on my dissertation committee. So there might be some commonalities here and there. And so I want to start off by saying that my work is really anchored on promoting the educational opportunities of students from linguistically diverse homes. And I have focused the bulk of my work on students who come from Spanish-speaking, low-income homes. And today what I'd like to talk about is this issue of vocabulary measurement. And it's kind of a very tricky space in the sense that, as Catherine mentioned, if a student comes from a non-native English-speaking home, and I'll stick with Spanish in this case, although we know that students come from a whole lot of different first languages here in the US context and otherwise. But if they're from a Spanish-speaking home and their English vocabulary development is lower than we would expect based on normative data based on monolingual English speakers, that's not too hard to believe. And so if we give a label of a student being at risk, that might be premature, in fact, because they don't have perhaps enough experience with the English language yet, and eventually they're going to get there. But then the issue of early identification could be really promising at the earliest stages, so if we think about the early childhood period. And so at some levels, it might be really good for targeted instruction. The problem really is that we don't have the kind of tools or the right measures to really tap into the knowledge that the students who come from Spanish-speaking homes bring to the table. And so for today's talk, I'm going to talk about a potentially promising approach. And so I'm going to focus the talk today on a pilot study that I just completed in Southern California that's based on measures that were normed on Spanish-English bilingual. So that means these are measures that were specifically designed for students who speak Spanish and English with different levels of proficiency. And you can begin using these measures at age 2, which is a really nice thing. And to my knowledge, there is no such measure. There are a couple of them, but they can begin being used at about age 5. So you're really missing like the preschool period. So this is, and some of you may be familiar with the receptive and expressive one-word picture vocabulary test, but this is the Spanish bilingual edition. So the whole idea here is that for the receptive measure, which receptive knowledge is we're really interested in thinking about what this child understands, and for expressive, what he or she can actually communicate. These measures are really tapping conceptual knowledge. And conceptual knowledge is really this idea of their world knowledge. So we don't really care if they have the label in Spanish or they have the label in English. It's just, do they know the concept? So a very easy example would be table. And if you gave the child a test where you're tapping their English vocabulary knowledge and they responded mesa, being a standardized measure, you have to mark it as incorrect. And even though you may really say, well, we really know this child knows the concept of what a table is, but they gave me the label in the wrong language, so it's marked wrong. So that's the whole idea, that conceptual knowledge you're able to get at, do they know the concept independent of the language in which they know it? And so this measure, you can use it receptively and expressively. And so what I did is this whole idea that, well, we kind of have a good amount of evidence, and the work that Catherine showed you with those little circles, tapping English vocabulary and Spanish vocabulary that Mariela Paez and Pan Tabor started, I had the opportunity to continue working with that same group of students through 8th grade, and I have to tell you that the picture didn't look much different. Now, these were kids that were from Spanish-speaking homes, in the New England area, and their instruction was essentially only in English, but they did come from Spanish-speaking homes, and over time, by the time they were about to start high school, those vocabulary gaps remained in English and certainly in Spanish. So that trajectory continued to look very similar. So we have a good amount of evidence that there are these gaps, right? And so if you give them a measure in English, they look low compared to monolingual English speakers. If you give them a measure in Spanish, they look low compared to monolingual Spanish speakers. But they're not monolingual Spanish or monolingual English speakers. So what I'm really interested in is thinking about what do they have in terms of their conceptual stores of knowledge, and how can we build on that? So the real question, so there's 3 key things that I will show you little glimpses of in the next couple of slides. And the first one is this very kind of, to me, intuitive question of what is the utility of utilizing these conceptual vocabulary measures as opposed to using monolingual English vocabulary tools, and that tends to be standard practice across many, many programs. And if we use these conceptual measures, does this change in any way the number of students that are flagged as being potentially at risk for vocabulary delays or at risk for poor academic achievement down the line? And finally, and another part that I'm really interested in, is looking beyond just these kind of quantitative measures, and here's the actual value I'm going to show you, to what is their kind of performance at the item level when we look at the types of items and the types of words that they know. So this is an item level analysis that I'll show you some graphs on. So these students all attended state-funded preschool program that was in English only here in California, and there were 46 students total. We purposely included more than a handful of them from monolingual English homes for this comparison purpose of saying, okay, well, if they're all from this state-funded preschool program and generally also from low-income homes, how do they compare to students that are also attending these state-funded programs from Spanish-speaking homes? So you can see that they're about 4.5 years old, and they were spread across 16 different classrooms. So I'll give you a chance to orient yourself to this, and I'll just highlight some of the things that I think are important. The monolingual English speakers are in blue, and then next to them are the students that I'm calling Spanish English, because they came from Spanish-speaking homes, but again, they're being instructed in an English-only environment at this young age. And they're all US born, but in contrast, the children from Spanish-speaking homes, all of their parents were, the mothers, were born outside of the US. And the picture for the fathers, by the way, is very similar. The majority are from Mexican origin. Maybe there's 1 or 2 from Peru, for example. And the children from monolingual English-speaking homes were predominantly US-born, the mothers. There's a big difference that's significant in terms of maternal years of education for the monolingual English speakers compared to the children who come from Spanish-speaking homes. There's a big difference in their actual poverty levels, so I calculated an income-to-needs ratio. Basically, if you're below 1, you're at poverty, so these children are average from the Spanish-speaking homes are at or near poverty, whereas the monolingual English speakers, and this was kind of surprising given that they're in the same state-funded preschool settings, had an income-to-need ratio that puts them at the middle income level and above. And there were also differences in nonverbal intelligence. So this is also a test that 100 is the mean, 15 is the standard deviation. So you can see that the monolingual English speakers are performing 1 standard deviation above the mean on a measure of nonverbal intelligence that was selected because it's supposed to be used with children that come from culturally and linguistically diverse homes where there's low verbosity involved in terms of the administration. It's about images and sequences. And even though the Spanish-English bilingual students are certainly performing within the normal range, the monolingual English speakers are performing much better. And so here are the 2 key messages in terms of the use of these conceptual measures. Number 1, and I'm glad it didn't pan out any differently, is that the conceptual measures seem to hold some promise. Now, I can't make any sweeping conclusions about this. It is a generally small sample size, but the trend is certainly that if we're going to use English-only measures on students who are not English-only speakers, we're probably going to get only partial knowledge reflected. And we are probably going to over-identify some students as being, quote, at risk. And number 2 is that there was a difference in performance by modality, and by that I mean their receptive and expressive knowledge really differed by language, where they seem to perform much better in Spanish receptive vocabulary as opposed to expressive. And I'll hopefully that'll make more sense when I show you the graphs of the item level performance, but essentially with the bilingual measures, you will administer the measure depending on the child's language dominance, and because all of the parents said the children came from Spanish-speaking homes, I don't have time to show you that level of detail, but we asked a series of questions about what the child speaks to the mom, to the dad, if there's a dad in the home, to other adults in the home, etc. And overwhelmingly, they are effectively speaking Spanish at home. So we tested all of the children first in Spanish, and if need be, they switched to English. And so here's the big takeaway, and let me orient you to this. So the top is receptive vocabulary in English. So the monolingual English speakers have an average standard score, again, 100 is the average 15 standard deviation of 107. And the Spanish-English bilinguals, if you measure their receptive vocabulary in English only, are 1 standard deviation below the population mean on average. That is a statistically significant difference. Same thing with expressive vocabulary, and even to a larger extent, 113 for the monolingual English speakers compared to 78 for the students from Spanish-speaking homes. Now, many times that's all you kind of get, and many teachers will get this picture of, well, depressed vocabulary receptively and expressively in English. And if you, however, give them the measure where you're tapping their conceptual knowledge, so independent of the language in which they know the label, the picture is considerably different. Now you have a standard score of 103 for receptive vocabulary and of 102, or if you round it, 103 as well for expressive. And that difference is not statistically significant. They're performing right on par with their monolingual English-speaking counterparts. And remember, this is even though there are big income differences. So just looking at this raises a lot of questions in my mind in terms of the practices that we have policy-wise and certainly at the classroom level and what that translates for instructional implications. When we think about this idea of at-risk identification, what I did here is divided the group up, again, monolingual English compared to the students from Spanish-speaking homes, and giving you a breakdown in percentage, hopefully that's easier, of how many of the students are falling 1 standard deviation below the mean with the normal range or 1 standard deviation above the mean. And what I hope you can appreciate from here is that if we look at English receptive vocabulary knowledge for monolingual versus Spanish-English bilingual, there's a pretty huge difference. None of the students from monolingual English-speaking homes are scoring more than 1 standard deviation below the mean in English receptive, whereas nearly half of them would be flagged as at risk in terms of being more than 1 standard deviation below the mean in English receptive. But if we account for their conceptual knowledge, now the percentage distribution kind of mirrors or reflects more of what we might expect based on the monolingual English speakers' performance. And the same pattern, I won't read you the numbers, you can just glance at that yourself, ends up happening when we look at the expressive knowledge, conceptually as opposed to monolingual only. But again, if you just take this number of roughly 103 as the conceptual and expressive performance for the bilingual group, that doesn't really tell you too much about how much do they know in Spanish and English, how can we target instruction. So what we did then is looked at their item level performance. Oops, I think I went one too fast, yeah. This is a lot, and you may not be able to read the bottom, but we try to categorize this based on the types of words included on this assessment. This is the receptive vocabulary performance, and this is only for those children from Spanish-speaking homes. So this is tapping their conceptual knowledge, what's happening at the item level. And what you see here is the red bars represent their correct response in Spanish, and blue represents when they had to switch over to English, if that makes sense, because they didn't get the item right in Spanish, so instead they responded in English. And really, we don't have time to go through the categories of words, but there are things like furnitures and rooms, descriptive words, which ones of these are outside things, clothing, body parts. So we're kind of trying to make sense so that we can try to inform classroom instruction in the type of words that might be targeted. But this is receptive, and hopefully you can see a lot of red, meaning that they're getting a lot of these items correct in Spanish without the need to resort to English, so to speak. But when we look at their performance expressively, right, this is what they actually have to say, not just what they understand, there's a lot more blue. That means that if we had only tapped their knowledge, let's say with a monolingual measure in Spanish, we would have gotten a very different pattern of performance. But this allowed them to then switch to the other language that they're also navigating and learning. And in this case, there's a lot more knowledge that seems to be reflected expressively in English as opposed to where it was more Spanish receptive. So I'm trying to kind of make sense of what this might mean. I kind of put this together in thinking of, well, number one, at least we can hopefully take away that, and this is not my idea certainly, that the children that we're dealing with when we talk about dual language learners are not monolinguals. That should kind of be very obvious, but I think it's important to remember that if we're going to use measures that are normed on monolinguals, that's probably worth at least thinking about a bit more. For parents, potentially, it's this whole idea that we just want to promote language use independent of the language that they're actually using. And there's a lot of fear, anecdotally, that I know and from a lot of work that's being done, that parents may not want their children, for example, to be exposed to Spanish too much because they're afraid that it's going to compromise their English skills. And we know that at least the evidence to date points to the direction that that's not exactly the case. And when we think about the teachers that are working with dual language learners and their families, I think one of the questions that comes up a good amount, or has come up from other folks, is, well, do these conceptual measures tell you anything about future performance? Do they predict, for example, fourth grade reading comprehension skills? I don't know, because this measure came out in 2012, and as far as I can tell, that hasn't been tested yet, and it's certainly a direction in which we need to go. But even if hypothetically it didn't tell us much about future performance, this whole idea of expectations and the kind of atmosphere you have at the classroom level, I think is important, because if I was an early childhood teacher and I saw a profile of a Spanish speaking student that looked really low in Spanish and really low in English, as opposed to a profile of a student with their conceptual knowledge being tapped into, I think I would probably have a different kind of set of expectations. And I know that may not sound very appealing to say it in that way, but I think it's the kind of environment that we set up at the classroom level and the expectations that we might have of students. So that's all I have for today, and thank you for your time.
Ms. Pence began her teaching career at Marin Head Start, where she taught at several locations for 11 years. And for the past 5 years, Ms. Pence has created and taught at the Marin Community Foundation funded preschool program for Linwood Elementary in Novato, California. This program strives to create free, high-quality preschool learning opportunities for predominantly dual language, lower socioeconomic children and their families. She has also served as a Marin County mentor, guiding and mentoring student teachers from local colleges for the past 8 years. In her capacity as an ECE mentor and master teacher, she has presented and served on numerous committees in Marin. And in addition to her teaching and mentoring, Ms. Pence also consults for the Center for Childhood Creativity based at the Bay Area Discovery Museum. And so now, Ms. Pence.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share my experience working with dual language learners and their families. It's not often that I get the privilege to have a venue in which to share, especially alongside amazing experts in the field, and I'm very grateful. I'm better known as Miss Robin at my school. I'm the head teacher in a self-contained classroom serving 20 preschool-aged children at Linwood Elementary, located in Novato. That's my classroom. Before I talk more about my classroom, I should first clarify that it is not mine alone. I work alongside an amazing and gifted associate teacher, Rosa Vasquez, with 20-plus years teaching experience, and she also came from Marin Head Start. We also have the great fortune of having the world's most dedicated volunteer, Joe Blackett, and that's him right there. Retired Coast Guard captain, volunteering 22 years in Marin preschools. This classroom also belongs to our school, Linwood Elementary, the children, families, and the community. It is not mine, it is ours, and I view it as such. 5 years ago, Marin Community Foundation offered Linwood Elementary financial support and training in the form of a grant to create best practices to help support children who statistically tend to land in the achievement gap, precisely the children I had been serving at Head Start. I jumped at the chance to help create a preschool classroom funded by MCF grant money with the criteria to serve any preschool-aged child in our school's district area the year before entering our Linwood kindergarten. School data at the time showed roughly 2/3 of all children entering our kindergarten as having no preschool experience. By adding our preschool and offering a 5-week kinder academy in the summer, our data from this year indicates 89% of incoming kindergartners had some form of preschool experience. The children enrolled in our classroom are predominantly 4 years old. Most come from homes where Spanish is the primary language. For example, this year I have 19 first language Spanish speakers and 1 first language English speaker. All but 2 of our current children qualify for free and reduced lunch. Our program is 4 hours a day, 4 days a week, Monday through Thursday. Rosa and I are funded for a 30-hour work week. We use the DRDP as our assessment tool and supplement with goals found in the California Foundations. I've been asked to address successful strategies and challenges of 3 main areas in regards to how our classroom supports language development for dual language preschoolers enrolled in our classroom, interactions and support for families, how we support home language, and whole and small group interactions. I will begin by addressing interactions and support for families. I had experienced the importance and benefit of parent engagement during my time at Head Start and felt strongly that we would include parents in all aspects of our classroom. I noticed that children with highly engaged parents tended to have better social, physical, language, and academic outcomes. With that in mind, we created a classroom culture and attitude that conveyed a spirit of respect, welcome, and gratitude. We strive to view our parents from a strength-based lens, no matter their circumstances. Ultimately, we wanted to build trusting and open relationships to better actively engage our children and families. I've learned that one of the best ways to support families is to give them opportunities, lots of them. Opportunities to be in the classroom, to give input, to collaborate, network with other parents, to get information, to volunteer, communicate, and more. When Rosa and I are lesson planning, we are always actively looking for opportunities for our parents to be a part of the curriculum. For example, this year we created a grocery store with the children. After gathering information about the children's prior knowledge, we invited a parent from our classroom who works at a grocery store to be our project expert. The parents' input greatly expanded the children's understanding and gave him an opportunity to connect in a meaningful way with our classroom. Something else that has helped me personally engage with parents and children is I learned to speak Spanish. My abilities are far from perfect, but this skill allows me to communicate with families without needing a translator. It has made me feel somehow closer, more responsive, and approachable. I've also gained a new perspective. I know a bit more about how it feels to be an emergent language learner because I am one. And I know firsthand its challenges and its gifts. I want to mention a few of our more successful strategies and opportunities for engaging parents and supporting them to be vital participants in their child's education. One strategy is our family reading time. We start our preschool day at 8 o'clock, a half hour before class starts for the upper grades. Upon arrival, both parents and children sign in. Children have their own sign-in sheets. Then choose a book and they read for 10 to 15 minutes each morning. Older siblings often read to their brothers and sisters too. I especially love to see my former students reading to a sibling. Our goal is to carve a little time out of each day for our busy family members to read or just simply share a book with their child. The children often have favorite books that they retell their parents. To further support language, literacy, and other skills in the home, we send home Raising a Reader bags filled with books in the child's first and second language. Each week, our classroom also has the opportunity to visit our school library for story time and to pick out another book for their bag. Our library visits have become opportunities for children to check out fiction as well as nonfiction books and on topics of interest in their home and their first and second language. On any given week, half to 2/3 of the children choose nonfiction books to bring home and read with their families. Each week, our children take home a red bag with 4 books, a Spanish or English homework handout that has several parent-child activities to do at home, and a reading log to track reading minutes. We have various family communication methods that also help with parent engagement. On a small whiteboard easel, we write a brief message of the day for families describing the day's activities and any reminders in Spanish and English. We also have family communication folders by the sign-in where we put translated school, community information flyers, and classroom newsletters. We also make sure to greet every child and family member each day, frequently touching base with them and exchanging information. Several times a year, we meet with each family to discuss a translated progress report that addresses their child's progress at school. I also take the time to emphasize how important they are as not only the most important teachers of their child, but their language teachers and their language teachers as well. We really try to encourage families to make home a place where they foster their family's first language. Many parents have expressed to me that they know families where children stop speaking Spanish and lost that important connection to their family, community, culture, as well as a skill useful when they join the workforce. I now encounter more parents that already implement a first language only rule in their homes. Another strategy is our family field trips to the Bay Area Discovery Museum. Our classroom is part of their Connections program. 5 times a year, we visit the museum, spend time doing specially planned science, nature, art exploration activities, and enjoy an especially rich school day. We invite all our families to attend, letting them know dates ahead of time so they can rearrange their schedules. We almost always have a family member with each child. We make space for younger siblings and strollers. Each family gets a free pass to return on their own. Our perspective is that field trips are not only for the children, but a rich opportunity for our families to engage with their child in creative and meaningful ways, not always feasible with limited time, resources, and transportation. Lastly, we have many parent engagement opportunities at our school, often planned by our family literacy staff, Dr. Jan Hutchinson and Luz Torres, our family advocate. Once a week, coffee chats, charlas con café, where parents have opportunities to hear brief presentations about topics of interest, like health and community resources. We also offer ESL classes, several weekend parent university days, joint PTA ELAC leadership meetings, festivals like Kermés, where we see many former and current preschool parents volunteer in the upper grades. Since implementing these practices, we've seen increased parent participation at our school and improved academic outcomes. I've noticed that when I get a sibling, I can see parents using strategies that they learned with their first child. I see parents more comfortable and confident in the classroom, and the children reflect that confidence with better outcomes at school. Next, I'll address how we support home language at Linwood Preschool. To put it too simply, it can be a challenge to meet the language needs of 20 children with varying degrees of first and second language abilities. Add to the mix children with speech and language special needs, and 10 months to ensure each child learns English while supporting their first language. We also take into consideration the vocabulary deficit children often have in their first language upon entering preschool. It sometimes feels like they should also hand out a magic wand to help us meet language standards. Thank goodness preschool-age children have these amazing brains that can learn really complicated skills quickly when given a rich learning environment. They amaze me every year by their progress and capacity to learn. Back in my Head Start days, I had served on a committee to create the Marin Head Start language policy with help from John Gunnarsson, who's here tonight. To describe their plan in simple terms, the strategy is to begin the year more often in the child's first language, while gradually increasing English throughout the year, also enriching the child's first language vocabulary when possible, something tricky when you get a third language that a teacher doesn't speak. More on that later. I decided to use the same strategy in our program. Rosa and I had to consider our own language strengths and weaknesses and how best to use our assets to our advantage. Rosa is fluent in Spanish, while not as strong in English, while the opposite is true for me. Ultimately, we learned and used a variety of strategies that have had a positive impact on students' language abilities that utilize both our linguistic strengths. One important aspect to our language approach is that we are very intentional about focusing on language in everything we plan and do. We want children to talk more than adults throughout the day. We look for ways to introduce and use rich vocabulary and new words in all our activities, including academic language in both Spanish and English. Some years, we have children who speak languages other than Spanish and English. When we are lucky enough for this to happen, we make sure that child and family know we value and celebrate their language too. We do this by teaching everyone simple salutations in that child's language. Hello, goodbye, thank you, please. We translate a couple of songs so we can sing them in all the languages in our classroom. We invite parents to translate classroom labels and signs. We make sure that child knows how wonderful it is to speak another language. A good example of this is a few years ago, we had a child whose dad and grandmother were from Rome, Italy. The family spoke Italian and English at home. At first, this little boy was very reserved and reluctant to share Italian with the other children. However, after all the children learned some words and songs in Italian, the little boy went from hesitant to very confident. He would pipe up at circle time that he wanted to ask his family for a particular word. You could see how our simple efforts to respect his second language made him feel like it was special and valuable. I loved hearing all my Spanish speakers that year saying buongiorno and grazie. I often hear our Spanish-speaking families simply labeled as Latino, as if they all originated from the same place. However, not all our Spanish-speaking families are from one country. For example, this year we have families originating from Mexico, Guatemala, Peru, and El Salvador. One family from Mexico comes from the Yucatan Peninsula and is of Mayan descent. The father shared with us that he has taught his son words in the Mayan language. When I mentioned it to his son how wonderful it was that he speaks Maya like his dad, he looked at me with a confident smile and said, "And I speak French." A child clearly proud to speak other languages. We give our families opportunities to share their particular language by inviting them to lead with the children. For example, we just had a mom and abuela from Mexico making tissue paper flowers with the children during free choice time. This activity was conducted entirely in Spanish, and that's actually a picture of them. And this was the project that they created. We try to make our classroom reflect the children as much as possible. When we make this effort, it often elicits rich language as well as helping to meet a variety of California foundation standards. For example, each child has their own family photo album that they make with their family at orientation at the beginning of the year. Throughout the year, children use the albums to talk about their families and explore photographs of their classmates' families too. We discuss how our families are same and different. We also label our classroom. Since we often change materials, one of the challenges I face is finding time to label everything in Spanish and English throughout the year, not to mention a third language, but I do my best. Our children's writing is another way we can support their first language. We often have the children create drawings to illustrate their ideas about various topics. They also love to write books and have them read at snack and story time. We are able to write their ideas and observations in Spanish and can ask parents to help us with other languages. We display their work on the walls and books on our bookshelf. Our writing area displays their writing and is full of materials, including rebus cards, for them to write to convey meaning. Our classroom is filled with books in Spanish, English, and some without text. We have books in all the areas of our little classroom. Children are read to each day at story time, family reading time, snack, free choice, and sometimes at outside time. Children will often read, We have many titles in both languages. Children will often read both. If I have a child who speaks another language, I check out books from the library or ask parents to let us keep a few books at school. Rosa will sometimes read to the children in Spanish, and I do too. We use questioning strategies to help children think about the text, and we also have some books that celebrate speaking different languages. Last, I'll address individual and group interactions. In our classroom, we use small and whole group formats for interacting with children. Our routine has 2 15 to 20-minute circle times, one first thing in the morning, after family reading time, and another after outside time. Circle time is full of a variety of language activities, such as singing, sign language, reading morning message, GLAD strategies, counting, math question of the day, front-loading topics to explore later in the day. We use a lot of gestures, movements, and opportunities for child leadership and support language and skill development. Even in whole group formats, we structure the activities so that children are actively engaged and have numerous opportunities for language. For example, we sometimes sit the children on buddy mats, 2 carpet squares taped together and labeled with each child's name. When brainstorming, we often ask children to think, pair, share. First thinking of what they want to say, turning to their mat buddy, and sharing that idea. This method helps children to all be sharing at once. And this method also aligns with the upper grades at our school. We also have a small group rotation 3 days a week. Children are split up into 3 small groups for activities led by a teacher or Joe, our volunteer. The teachers and Joe rotate each day, taking turns facilitating each small group. That way, we ensure all children get the same opportunity and each teacher gets a chance to work with every child. We often group children intentionally to meet certain needs. Rosa and I are both trained to use CLASS strategies, which stands for Classroom Assessment Scoring System, that address the quality of teacher-child interactions. Among other domains, it measures quality of feedback and language modeling. We were taught how to prompt thought processes by asking children to explain their thinking, providing additional information for expansion and clarification, scaffolding and feedback loops that encourage back and forth exchanges and follow-up questions, all while recognizing and reinforcing child effort and persistence. We learned how to use language modeling strategies for children at different levels of language ability. For example, I would use self and parallel talk for a child with lower emergent language abilities. This year, I have a child with special needs who has selective mutism. Our strategy for this child is to use self and parallel talk, using descriptive language about the child's interests and actions, like a play-by-play announcer. I know his receptive language is stronger than his expressive. like many dual language learners. His mother gives me feedback that at home he sings all our songs and talks about what he did at school. Our assessments, with much input and help from his parents, indicate he is learning the curriculum. We also use other language support methods such as repetition extension, open-ended questions, and advanced language strategies depending on each child's needs. In this manner, we are able to individualize language support for each child. I was trained to use GLAD, which stands for Guided Language Acquisition Design Strategies, 6 years ago. GLAD gives us further methods to support rich vocabulary development in academic language such as picture dictionary, graphic organizers, songs, chants that support a classroom theme or project. For example, we recently spent a month exploring a project to solve the driving question of how to hatch chicks from eggs. We used our picture dictionary to introduce a special word of the day such as incubator, writing the word with the children, drawing a simple picture, then using a gesture and movement to say the word many times. The children also sang songs, read books, had an incubator in the classroom, heard adults and other children and classroom experts use the focus word. Rosa teaches the word in Spanish. With so many meaningful uses and repetition of the vocabulary, children are able to use what they've learned to express their ideas and observation using richer language. We also use second step curriculum to support social emotional language so that children have language to talk about their feelings and the feelings of others and problem solve. We also use solution cards that remind children different strategies and words they might use to solve problems. By using various language building strategies, different grouping formats, letting children's interests and needs guide curriculum, and creating a joyful learning environment, our children often make great gains in language by the end of the school year. Also, our classroom is rarely quiet. We're really noisy. I was asked to address the challenges and complexities of this work, and for me, one of the challenges is the big things, often the big picture. How can I create a classroom learning experience that meets all the needs of the children in our care? How can we bring them to a skill level to be successful in kindergarten? How can we ensure all our preschoolers avoid the achievement gap? I often feel the magnitude of the responsibility. I'm also part of an elementary school. It has taken a lot of time and effort to build relationships with my principal, the kindergarten, and other teachers. I've served on many leadership committees trying to be a voice for early childhood best practices. I'm very aware of our school's strengths and weaknesses. Being part of a pre-K to 5 grade school expands my scope, another big picture for me to consider. Since all our preschoolers transitioned to kindergarten at the same school, I feel very fortunate to watch and track our former children as they pass through the grades. I can follow their progress and offer support to other teachers. This year, I served as part of a trainer team, gathering data about the current state of our assessment loop. We combed through our test data, which was DIBELS and MAP tests, and found 12 former preschool children in 3rd grade from our first cohort. That first program year, I taught 2 classrooms. One was Head Start and the other Linwood Preschool. After compiling their data, I was happy and relieved to find 8 out of 12 proficient or advanced in math, and 10 out of 12 nearing proficiency or proficient in language arts and vocabulary. As I wait for news of continued funding for our program, it was meant to be only a 5-year grant. I'm happy that data demonstrates an impact in a format that holds value for our funders. I feel the responsibility needing high enough outcomes to attract further funding so we can serve more children in the future. I recently read an article about the science of love. The research suggested that little moments of connection with others, they called them micro moments, can have big impacts on how others feel your love. This idea reminds me that sometimes it's just the little things we can do, noticing, inviting, looking for strengths, building on them, smiles, interactions, attention, giving opportunities, when all combined can have a big impact that that result in desired outcomes. When the big stuff overwhelms me, I remind myself to go back to focusing on the small stuff. Each day, the little things we can do, I can do. What opportunities can I create for children and families? Look for little teachable moments, because joy is in the details. Moments of grace that feed the spirit and empower me and others to continue to do this work. Thank you.
I just wanted to thank you for bringing such a different view of complexity to the issue of the World Cup. My name is Patricia Baquedano Lopez. I'm Associate Professor at the Graduate School of Education here at UC Berkeley. In my work as a language socialization scholar, I do not find the sort of deficit framings that we see in the Billion Word Gap, right? Because I am an ethnographer. I'm in the homes of families, in the earlier grades. So I know this is for the younger group of students, but I work with kindergartners, first and second graders. And something in Professor Snow's talk on the idea of developing words of world knowledge, right? What I find in the families and my students find is a richness of material that isn't the expected dinosaur kind of language, right? But say, for example, disciplinary content that can map onto political science and sociology, like immigration. And so the language of immigration is so rich that is unfortunately not always tapped onto in the schools, right? And so it's easy to miss those measures, right, that don't have this kind of language as an expected language the students can speak, right? That, you know, it goes unnoticed and may contribute to those larger deficit framings. But just to say that there's richness, and I appreciate very much how your work is showing that complexity among families. So thank you, just wanted to say that.
I have I might have two questions. I was wondering at your school, do you have transitional kindergarten? And I was also interested in your family reading. You mentioned before school starts, you have a family reading time. I was wondering if there's instruction with that or strategies given to parents, as well as is that through your Raising a Reader program? And if you could speak a little about your Raising a Reader program, I'd love to hear it.
So yes, we have TK at our school, and it's right now it's not separate from kindergarten. It's like a split, and that's just because of the number of students. They just don't have enough to make it into a classroom, and it's an issue. Regarding family reading time in the mornings, we do try and have at least once a year. We have Carrie Bacha, who's here tonight. I don't know if she's still here. Can you read your hand? She comes and does amazing parent workshops and talks to them about ways that they can not only read with their child and utilize the books in the bag, but also sing and tell stories. And she gets them up and they act out stories and you know what to do if you maybe can't read, how to also share books with your child in that capacity. So, but what I find is that they just love that time of the day. You know, the parents are just finding places all over the classroom, cuddling with their children and reading, and it's sort of a nice way to start the day.
One other question for you, Robin, about all of your parent involvement ideas are so incredible, and I'm wondering if you ever have parents who aren't cooperative and say they don't have time or don't show as much of an interest in being in the classroom, and how you handle that.
So first of all, I guess I don't think of them as being uncooperative. I try and build relationships with our families from the very beginning of the year to get to know them and to know what little things about their family. What happens is these families, they show up and they, you know, it's amazing. We fill the bus to capacity. And we say, you know what? If you can't come, maybe a tia or tío or abuela or somebody can come with that child. It doesn't have to be the parent. It's because the family is big, right? Yeah, thank you.
It strikes me from all three of the presentations that there's a lot of cognitive language framing of this. but that the real story here is a story of relationships, and that from teacher to parent, from teacher to child, and that it's the context in which there's an interaction among or between these people that makes the language become knowledge rather than just word. You want to comment?
Well, absolutely. I think it's the relationships that are presupposed in a way that this is what early childhood education has traditionally been good at. It's the area in which we don't need to think and plan and intervene, because the educators, the adults in early childhood settings, they're all over the relationships, right? I mean, they love the kids, they interact with the kids, it's not obviously easy to do that with a large number of kids, but it's what they're really good at. And the challenge then is to take it one level farther, the way Robin has done, and use it as a foundation for an enriched language and literacy environment, rather than just letting it be.
A very important example of something that I did in my preschool classroom this year, which was, we were talking about machines with children, and the children invented and built their own machines. And one of the machines was a machine to take sun rays and make them into stuffing for pillows. And so he had all the parts, and the team of children that worked on this, and they showed how the rays of the sun come in here, and they go around in this little thing, and it goes, they had it all figured out. But obviously, it's not doable. You can't actually make pillows out of sun rays. And so my point is that what the children gained from that experience was not a knowledge of an actual machine that can actually work, but there's a lot of reasoning and a lot of symbolic practice that happens. And so I guess I wanted to dispute a little bit your contention that knowledge was the important thing, and I guess I would focus more on discourse and things like reasoning and symbolization, and that sometimes what preschoolers want to think about really isn't part of the real world, and it's not what the fourth graders are going to be reading about, but that experience can still be very rich, and we can go beyond it just being lovely, and we can do very rigorous thinking with preschoolers about sometimes these imaginary ideas.
Yeah,
So.
no, that's a great sort of corrective to what might be an oversimplified interpretation of what we mean by knowledge. But the discourse that requires and generates thinking is clearly where you want to get to. And the trouble is, it has to be discourse about something.
Right.
And discourse about imaginary processes. I wouldn't call it not knowledge. I would still say there's a lot of discussion going on there about cause and effect, about relationships, and a lot of what we feed to kids in fairy tales and so forth is, of course, serving that need to be able to think beyond the range of the physical world.
I feel like a lot of the research when we talk about dual language learners is very much based on Spanish speaking and kind of like romance, L1 language. Is there any research that is kind of more along the like Asian languages that are dual language learners who are trying to learn English, who are, because it's linguistically it's very different, like Farsi compared to English or Arabic or Chinese. So is there any kind of research that are being done? Is the trend kind of similar to Spanish, or is it a totally different ballgame?
Well, that's why I did mention, although I didn't spend much time to talk about them, these cases of the Uyghur Chinese bilingual classroom that promoted acquisition of knowledge of Chinese and Uyghur. Uyghur and Chinese have nothing to do with one another. Uyghur is a Turkic language. Of the program in Oslo, where immigrant families speaking Urdu, Arabic, Somali, Polish, Ukrainian, Kurdish, the families are given books in the native language, and then those books are read in the classroom in Norwegian. And it's it's probably not quite as easy as Spanish to English in a way. You don't have the cognates, you don't have the same writing system. But the fact that the kids recognize the books and know what they're about means when those books are read in Norwegian, they have a handhold, an access to meaning that they just don't have otherwise. So, but you're absolutely right. We need vastly more research on the full array of different possibilities here. Absolutely, and whether there's special adaptations for languages that are more different from English than Spanish.
On that note, I'd like to ask Professor Mancilla-Martinez, if you had unlimited funds, what kind of studies would you like to see?
Well, I think this whole issue of, I just give you guys a little glimpse of what things might look like when you move away from monolingual normed measures, but they're still standardized measures. So the data that you saw today is still based on measures that are a one-on-one testing based on norms from a given population. So they have limitations, I think, if we're talking about specifically early childhood settings, and children may not be comfortable with that kind of a format, and you still may not get the full representation of the knowledge that they actually have. So I'd like to, in another kind of other arm of work that I'm doing, I am looking at their actual interactions. The way the teachers are talking with the students and trying to get at more at this whole issue of the type of language interactions that are genuinely happening in the classroom, not that we're getting based on a one-on-one assessment. So I think it would be really nice to have that information, because when we tell teachers either talk more or use high-quality language, I don't think we really know what that high-quality language is and what type of interactions really promote more language learning. As Catherine was kind of saying, those studies, they seem to make intuitive sense that if you tell them to talk more, well, there's going to be gains in vocabulary and subsequently in maybe reading comprehension, but they're not as, I at least can't tell you, here's the 5 good strategies to use, even with monolingual English speakers maybe, and certainly not with dual language learners. So I think a study that goes beyond this kind of assessment based on standardized measures, looking at the real language happening in the classrooms and marrying those two approaches in some ways, would give us a much deeper understanding of the process of language development that could help us guide the design of future assessments and guide also instruction at the classroom level.
One final question.
I wonder if any of the panelists have any guidance for those of us that are interested in, as we move into the world of quality rating systems for classrooms, whether we like it or not. You mentioned that you are using class in your dual language classroom. Are there any tools that you would point us to for teacher-child interactions or teacher practice that you believe are reflective of good practices for dual language learner instruction?
I'm just trained with class, and I've received a bunch of training about, I've been trained as someone that could do a class observation, and then I've also been trained as a participant. So that's, and thankfully, because our county's kind of focusing on it as a quality project, we've received additional sort of whenever we have a training about something else, we get further information about how that relates to class. So everybody's on the same page, and that's really helpful. I do know that I think the new ECHRS, there's a new ECHRS out, and that has, it used to be all about environment, but I think now it has some teacher-child interaction, and maybe Dr. Snow, or you know more about the new ECHRS. I don't have one, but that's my understanding. And it is online if you want to care to look at that. And if your program has worked with ECHRS, that might be a nice way to scaffold onto that instead of bringing in class, which is a little more elaborate. I don't know if that's helpful, but those are the ones that I know.
It's really just if class is working for you with a dual language classroom, because there's a lot of...
Yeah, I will say that it's not always easy, and it's not always clear exactly what they're looking for, that it's been a process for me, and I have to sometimes remind myself when I get a score back, I'm like, why did I get that score? Because I don't understand what they were wanting from me. So but the more I do it, I think the better it's making me as a teacher and more self-reflective in certain areas. It's focusing me on the feedback loop. It's focusing me on, just variety of interactions that they're measuring. And when I don't understand, they've given me a coach, and that supports me to figure it out even more. So I keep tweaking it, and I think that it is making me a better teacher.